Okay, welcome everyone. Alums, current students, faculty, staff, really delighted to have you here. My name is Alnoor Ebrahim. I'm a professor of management here at Fletcher, as well as at the Tisch College of Civic Life, both at Tufts. I teach courses on leadership, as well as strategy for NGOs and social enterprises. And I'm going to moderate this panel of remarkable speakers that we have today on the topic of sustainability in business. So I'm going to introduce them very briefly, but then I'll give them a chance to speak more specifically about their work. And we will have some time for questions. There's microphones. And when you do have questions in the last 20 minutes or so, I encourage you to use those because we are recording. And that way your questions will actually get recorded. So the topic of the panel is business and sustainability in a competitive world. And the reason for having these four remarkable people on the panel in front of you is to showcase the strengths that we have at Fletcher on this topic. So I'm going to introduce them just very briefly, coming down from the end. So we'll start with Dean Bhaskar Chakravorti. He's our Dean of Global Business here at Fletcher. He is also the founding executive director of the Institute for Business in the Global Context here, through which he also created a remarkable research program called the Digital Planet, which looks at digital development in over 90 countries. If you haven't visited the website, I really encourage it. They've got some remarkable resources on that site. Prior to his work in academia, he was a partner at McKinsey & Company. Next to him is Professor Jette Knudsen. She's the Shelby Cullom Davis Professor of International Business here at Fletcher. She also spends a lot of time at the Copenhagen Business School with the Corporate Social Responsibility Group at that institution. So she brings both her work here as well as a European perspective to bear on issues of social responsibility, of regulation, of work and employment. Her areas of focus are corporate social responsibility and the future of work, which we're all kind of witnessing ourselves as it changes. So delighted to have both Bhaskar and Jette here on this panel. Next, we have Ken Pucker, who is a professor of practice here at Fletcher. Ken comes to us previously from being the chief operating officer at Timberland. He's also an advisory director at Berkshire Partners and serves on a number of nonprofit boards. So very central work on strategy and sustainability. And then finally, we have Quyen Tran, who is the Director of Impact Investing at BlackRock, as well as Head of Sustainable Investing in Fundamental Equities, also at BlackRock. Here at Fletcher, she teaches a course on impact investing and brings all of that practical experience as well as conceptual work that she's done to bear for our students. So, really strong strength on issues of sustainability in business. What I'd like to do is we'll start with Bhaskar and work our way down. In just a minute each, if you would say a little bit more in terms of introduction to you about either what you teach or your core area of research, and then we'll get into the deeper questions. Bhaskar?
Great, thank you, Alnoor. And if we had time, we'd have a similarly lavish introduction to Alnoor as well, and hopefully we'll have an opportunity to do that. Wonderful to see so many familiar faces around this room, and hopefully we'll get a chance to chat about all the wonderful work that all of you are doing in the area of a sustainable world. Whether you're using business or not, there is a combination of tools that we hopefully train all our graduates to go off and deploy and be fearless in being able to pull from that toolbox. And that sort of brings me to the core of my own work, which is hopefully encouraging a degree of fearlessness in terms of the toolbox and putting not just an understanding of law and policy and global affairs, but also the tools of business in that toolbox, and thinking about business as a powerful lever for change. In terms of what I teach a class on inclusive innovation, which largely focuses on how we think about business model innovation for accomplishing the objectives of profitability and sustainable development. Also teach a class on strategic management, which looks at the potential tensions and complementarity between strategic objectives that companies need to accomplish and preserving the objectives of long-term sustainability. And sustainability in two forms, in sustainability in profits and sustainability of the larger environment, marketplace, and communities in which companies operate. So I'll just pause there and we'll have a chance to sort of come back and turn this over to Jette.
Well, thank you, Alnoor, and thank you to all of you for coming here today. I have been working on sustainability for the last 20 years, and I have to say this has been really exciting. When I started working on this, I became the director of a think tank in the Danish Ministry for Employment about 20 years ago, and I remember my colleagues in academia telling me, but Jette, why are you doing this? Why are you studying something that doesn't exist? And I have to say that was a little depressing when my colleague, who I really respected, said that. But I can tell you, this has been a remarkable journey for the last 20 years because this field is just growing very, very much. As a political scientist, working in a business school, I have been particularly interested in the role of regulation of corporate social responsibility, sustainable business, or business responsibility, whatever you choose to call it, because oftentimes, and I think this is particularly the case in America, we look at corporate social responsibility as voluntary, the kind of things you do that go beyond legal compliance. But if you think about it, regulation laws really shape the way that companies engage in sustainability. Just think about the US with very, very strong tradition of philanthropy. If you compare that to my home country, Denmark, we have that through foundations, but not through individuals as we do here, because we have a very different political system with a welfare state that takes care of a lot of these things. With respect to corporate social responsibility, we have seen in the last couple of years a ton of regulation in this country, in places like India, but especially in the European Union. And right now, basically what we're faced with is a tsunami of regulation that is requiring companies to do a due diligence with respect to human rights and labor rights, environment and climate in their supply chains. Listed companies also have to report on sustainability in their annual report. And just recently, I talked to the head of the research unit here in the US of Sustainalytics, and he said that those regulations in the EU are impacting about 1/3 of listed firms in the US as well. So what we're seeing now is a ton of regulation. And just the last thing I'll say is in Copenhagen, a friend of mine is a partner in PwC. She runs a sustainable business unit. And within 3 years, she's grown it from 10 to 40 people, and she's still growing it because there's such a huge demand for people to do corporate social responsibility, due diligence, and reporting. So I say this to our students, this is a growth field for sure. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Alnoor. I'm glad to be here. Ken Pucker. I teach or have taught 2 classes here. One is called Sustainable Business Systems, which is an integrated look at sustainability business and a concept called systems dynamics. And the other is a class called The Origins and Efficacy of ESG Investing.
And thanks, Alnoor. Hi, everyone. I'm Tran. I teach impact investing at Fletcher. And I have to say, before I say anything else, I'm really proud that our students last year placed 2nd worldwide in the global impact investing competition. And this year they grabbed 1st place. So just go on our website and or social media, you'll see them. They're very happy. But no, it really is because of everything that I see in this room. Past generations, students, mentors, alums, faculty, staff, advisors, and of course their friendships. So it really is a special place. So I've only been teaching here for 2 years. I'm an industry practitioner. And what I teach is specifically impact investing, a segment within sustainable investing. And I teach our students how to debate so that they can discern both sides of an argument for sustainable investing and against at a company level, enterprise level, fixed income bonds, so different asset classes, and then at a product level, meaning at the funds level, whether it's a mutual fund, private equity fund, et cetera, because the standards, as some of our panelists have already alluded to, they change. They're meant to do well, but they're their regulation, their efforts. And so there's always nuances. And so what's important is not a definitive definition of sustainable impact investing, but something that's common, believable, credible, right? But that they're able to debate. So that's what we do. And so it's really fun. It's really nice to see.
Thank you all four. Let's go a little bit deeper now, and we'll go in the other direction now. So Quyen, we'll start with you. And in a sense, you were already taking us there. Is there a particularly thorny problem or challenge that you experience in the sustainable business or sustainable investing space, either in your direct work or in your teaching, that you feel that we really need to get a handle on?
Yeah, so I love how you start with the hardest question and then you ask me first. Just like perhaps how you call on students. But no, I think the thorniest issue is accidental greenwashing. There's a lot of well-intended efforts by many practitioners, not just corporations, nonprofits, even universities investing. Should they divest? Should they not divest in fossil fuels? And if we don't, does that mean that we're greenwashing? If we do, so it's really, really hard because there's a lot of multi dimensions in the decision making. You're a fiduciary. You also have to make sure you generate a financial return that can sustain the university's needs or foundation, whatever your organization you're representing. So the issue of greenwashing in and of itself is, it's not good, but it's the complexity of the decision making. So I think that's really hard. And so that really makes it a special place to teach that at the Fletcher School, where it is an interdisciplinary academic curriculum. But I think to combat that, coming from a place of, like diplomacy, assuming good intention, right? And then just analyzing the arguments in a methodology. And for example, ESG, everything. I think a lot of us are familiar with ESG ratings. The actual definition of an ESG rating is simply an assessment of whether or not that company, that enterprise can manage its risks in terms of environmental risks, exposures, social risks, and governance risks. Governance risk, is there a potential conflict of interest in the governance structure? Environmental risk is like, is the headquarters located along a coastline that's exposed to physical climate risk, more intense extreme weather, et cetera, and how the company or enterprise is managing the risk. So that's what an ESG rating simply is, an assessment of its resiliency. Now, when misapplied, and we assume that it means that any improvement in an ESG rating therefore equates to sustainability. Not necessarily. It's just able to better manage its risk. It can, but it may not. It meaning an improvement in ESG rating. It can or may not equate to sustainability progress on the environment. And so I think the key to greenwashing is really understand methodologies, including a regulation, for what they are, and not to misapply them by accident. And then that'll create a lot of noise, in the media, in the industry, and confusion. And that ultimately places an impediment, on the scaling of these things with integrity. And so that's where, the heartbreak is. There's a lot of good efforts, but because of this unvirtuous cycle of misunderstanding, I think that's where the problem is.
Thank you very much, Quyen. This is a huge issue. I'm sure many of you have read about it. Quyen is in the middle of this with her work at BlackRock as well as in her teaching. So really delighted to have that very candid perspective on the challenge there. Ken, over to you.
So there are three areas of research that I've been focused on. The first is the efficacy of corporate voluntary sustainability. The second is circularity, which is specific now. My focus is specific to the fashion industry and whether we can, in fact, decouple resource growth from consumption. And the third is whether ESG investing has any benefits in terms of social or environmental welfare. But I'll focus on the second for just a moment because we already touched on ESG some. So on the question of circularity, I've just written a piece that's called A Circle That Isn't Easily Squared, that looks at the gap between rhetoric and reality when it comes to the fashion industry. I can give you one example. H&M currently manufactures and sells over 500 million garments a year. They've committed that by the year 2030, they're going to double that to over 1 billion units. And at the same time, more than halve the environmental footprint of each unit sold. And the way they're going to do that is by adopting a circular model where you buy a sweater, you wear it for a year, you return it, it gets shredded, turned into thread, upcycled, and made into another sweater. And conceptually, the idea sounds attractive, but between the conceptual idea and practice, there's obstacles that are political, economic, behavioral, scientific, and the industry is talking more about aspiration than practice. And so today, in fashion, less than 1% of all goods are actually upcycled into fashion. And when you see recycled on a garment, 99% of that is plastic bottles that have been melted into thread and then reused in garments. And so the question is, my question is, should we be focused on circularity? Or the obstacles too big? And if the answer is yes, then where else should we be focused? Because the industry as a whole has an outsized impact on the planet, both socially and environmentally. I could share lots of statistics, but I think I'll leave it at that for the time being.
Thank you, Ken. Jette?
Thank you. So I'll continue along the lines that we are now moving, sort of the more critical, thorny issues. You're all familiar with the adage that which gets measured gets managed, but do we measure the right things? And so 2 examples. In 2013 in Bangladesh, there was a building that housed more than 1,100 workers, and that building collapsed, and all the workers, the 1,100 workers died, and 2,500 or so were wounded, some of them very badly. Now, the day before, the Business for Social Compliance Initiative, which is a Northern European initiative, had been there to do an audit of production. And although workers told the auditors that there were cracks in the wall and those cracks were visible, that wasn't included in the audit because the audit wasn't measuring the structural building safety. So that's an example, I think, of these codes of conduct that do a lot of good things, but they don't always measure the right things. The other issue, and we have heard a little bit about the ESG, environment, social, and governance issues, that's now become a big deal. Now at MIT, they call it, I think quite appropriately, the Aggregate Confusion Project. And why is that? That is because if you're looking at the E, climate change, and you are adding some social element, human rights, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and some governance issue as well, you add that together, what does that really say about a company? It's very difficult to actually add these things because they are so very different. And with respect to how these rating agencies that we have out there do their ESG analysis, they diverge very much. It's very different from one rating agency to another. So what is it that we're really learning from these rating agencies? How are they performing it? What kind of knowledge do we get from them? So I think we have a lot of problems in terms of how what we measure and how we measure it. And I think going forward, this is maybe something we can talk more about also in the Q&A. How can we do this? How can we do this better so that we're not wasting a lot of resources and also coming up with conclusions about companies that are maybe wrong? The last thing I'll say is at Copenhagen Business School, I am involved in a project funded by NASDAQ, where one of my colleagues has just studied large US listed firms and found that those that perform well on E and those that perform well on ESG, they basically emit more carbon than the other firms. So is this a measurement problem? What is it? We're not sure. We're looking into that, but I think that speaks to some of the challenges with our ESG measurements. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Bhaskar?
Wow, so it's a heavy topic and it's getting heavier as we kind of move at this end of the table. I feel like I need to offer some light at the end of this increasingly longer tunnel. Just to add a little bit more darkness in this tunnel, we are doing a study right now on the state of trust in ESG metrics, and all things in ESG, trust among the investor community, both the asset managers, asset owners, and investment advisors. And lots of interesting learnings there. But one major learning is that what gets measured gets managed. There's a lot of managing going on, but the measurements aren't particularly trustworthy. So there is a fair amount of confusion in the market, and but that's okay. We're at the very start of a very long journey, so it's okay for us to have a number of divergent sources to draw from. Many of the firms that we have spoken with, some of them have used the basic ingredients of what is available from the current agencies, and they built their own. And so it creates opportunities for all of you who are here in the room who are interested in this topic to actually be a part of shaping something that is that's still in the very early stages. In terms of more a broader area of research that I've been engaging in as part of the digital planet that Alnoor mentioned. We started a research initiative exactly 3 years back called Imagining a Digital Economy for All, which reduces to the very handy acronym IDEA. And the whole idea behind IDEA was whether we could use digital technologies as a force multiplier to narrow the gap between where we are today and meeting the Sustainable Development Goals. And of course, we are falling further and further behind. We are falling further and further behind prior to the pandemic, and through the pandemic, we fell even further behind. So the idea of behind digital technologies is perhaps they can speed a few things up. They can put technologies in the hands of more people. There's now the more mobile phones available to people than access to clean water and toilets. Perhaps that could provide a way to include people in the workforce, include them in financial institutions, include them in healthcare and education and a variety of other places. And we're uncovering a number of different aspects of how inclusive digital technology has been. And we also, of course, all recognize that digital technology is both a force for inclusion, but it's also a force for division. And so trying to identify where these two meet, and where the needle is, and how do we move the needle in the direction of inclusion and multiplication versus division is an important part of our research. We are going in a number of different directions here. We are studying this question across pretty much all the countries in the world where the internet is reached. We're trying to understand the significance of digital public infrastructure, which is sort of an emerging discussion that is happening in many fora, and the importance of digital public infrastructure in providing a foundation that then becomes almost a playground for the private sector, for entrepreneurs, for tech innovators, for government to provide services to people at population scale. We're also trying to understand where some of the emerging technologies are taking us, such as, of course, the topic du jour, artificial intelligence. How is artificial intelligence advancing and where it isn't, and where potentially we are kind of falling into, kind of a zone of no return. So I'll just kind of pause there, kind of raising these issues. Happy to answer questions because there's a lot to explore there, but I don't want to hog the time. So we'll put it back to the next question from Alnoor.
So the next question is going to be about integration. It's not on your original list of questions, so you'll have to think on your feet. But that's what we do at Fletcher, right? We take disparate perspectives on an issue and we try to bring them together. So we're hearing from our four panelists that when we think about sustainability and business, the intersection of the two, there's at least kind of four really massive challenges that they've laid out, right? Quyen started with greenwashing and the fact that the methodologies are still very much under development, and how they get, ultimately their tools and how they get used can be used for actually advancing sustainability, but can also be used for masking the lack of sustainability. So we've got that methodological problem that can lead to greenwashing. We've got the problem of actually doing circularity in the economy that Ken mentioned specifically to the fashion industry, right? So that only 1% of fabrics are actually truly recycled. So we've got a long way to go, and the rhetoric is far ahead of the reality. So can circularity actually be done? Second big problem we're hearing. Third big problem we're hearing from Jette is that, well, you know, the ratings being done by the agencies, a methodological question, aren't really trustworthy. A student of mine for his capstone last year looked at 2 industries and looked at the ratings provided by MSCI and the ratings provided by Sustainalytics, and the top 10 companies were not the same. And so this is the state of the industry right now in terms of methodology, and the regulation is way behind, even though we're seeing some of it in Europe right now, as Jette mentioned, leading to, you know, what you refer to as the aggregate confusion project. So we've got that massive challenge. And then of course, Bhaskar leading us to the question of, well, what is the level of trust even within the industry around ESG? And, you know, we're now adding sort of the challenges, both the potential as well as the risks of AI, of artificial intelligence, in either helping us or confusing us further. So massive challenges. So the question that I have for any of you, in whatever order you would like, is what is the light at the end of the tunnel? Are you seeing it? And are you seeing examples of convergence, of the beginnings of agreement on where all of this might go?
I can try one thing. I've been involved for the last 20 months working in New York State to pass legislation called the New York Fashion Act. I'd encourage you to go online and take a look at it. We picked New York State and not federal because it's easier to pass legislation that's consistent with what we think the right direction is in a state that has 2 houses that are controlled by Democrats and a Democratic governor. And also it's the fashion capital of the US and it's big. So that's why we picked New York State. But the act requires that any company that chooses to sell in the state of New York with revenues in excess of $100 million globally must comply with the act. And it borrows some from OECD work on due diligence and supply chains, and requires that companies provide information about all tiers of their supply chain. So typically an apparel business will be 4 different tiers, from finished goods all the way to raw materials. It requires they provide information on percentage of goods that are recycled, water use, CO2 emissions, things like that. But it also requires that companies sign up for and are approved for science-based targets, which is an initiative that was put together by 5 different NGOs that says it's not sufficient for companies just to set goals, but the goals have to be consistent with planetary boundaries, and they have to be achievable, and they have to be both short and long-term objectives. And in the case of fashion, it would say at simplest level that these companies have to reduce their emissions by between 4 and 5% a year, independent of growth, because that's what the planet needs, independent of what they can do. And in terms of integration, we have a coalition that includes unions, it includes obviously politicians, it includes progressive brands, and we'll see if we're able to actually get it done. The one thing I should mention as well is it's not voluntary. There are consequences of not delivering on the goals. So if you choose to sell in New York and this bill passes and you don't deliver on your science-based targets, for example, the Attorney General in the state can choose to fine the company up to 2% of revenue annually. And so for a company like the one I used to work at, that'd be a $37.5 million fine if they didn't comply. And so even though the act is still in process, the industry is paying a great deal of attention to it, and it's already causing, I think, very progressive shifts. The ultimate objective is to lift the floor, to create convergence where brands have to collaborate to solve problems like the grid in Vietnam, as opposed to just rely on Eileen Fisher, Stella McCartney, or Patagonia to do the work. We need all brands together, and it's very doable, but it needs to be, we need to force kind of collaboration to make it happen.
Yes, Jette.
very, very interesting. I'd like to hear more about this afterwards. So I'll give two examples, one concrete example and one more process oriented in terms of answering the question about integration. So I mentioned the Rana Plaza factory collapse in Bangladesh, and I will say that after the collapse, there were two very large initiatives, the Accord and the Alliance. One, the Alliance primarily by US or North American firms, and the Accord primarily set up by European firms to improve structural building safety in Bangladesh. And I think it's fair to say that that has really played a major role in improving the safety of garment workers in Bangladesh. Now, in terms of their human rights, labor rights, and so on, that's still very problematic. And that has a lot to do with the way that the Bangladesh government and garment manufacturers collaborate and focus especially on very low-end products. And the major buyer is actually H&M that we just heard about before. In terms of process and integration, I think what we're seeing many boards focus on, and I work with boards primarily in Europe, I have to say, and here some of the boards, and I quote here the CEO, former CEO of Best Buy, it's not what you do, it's why you do it. So focusing on the corporate purpose is something that enables boards to be starting a process of prioritization, because I think we have talked here a lot about ESG. It's a huge agenda: diversity, equity, and inclusion, circularity, corporate governance initiatives, etc. It's just a lot of things. And for companies, they can't do all of this. They don't have the resources, they don't have the knowledge. And frankly, there are certain things that are more important to companies in particular sectors than others. So if you're a pharma sector, access to health is very important. If you're in the fashion industry, circularity is very important. So focusing on the corporate purpose as a way of prioritizing, and a lot of companies that I've worked with focus on the sustainable development goals. There's 17 of them, as probably a lot of you know. But what the company is really about, what is the purpose of the company, why is the company operating, I think is a way to help companies prioritize the most important aspects of this very broad agenda. So I see that as a way of integrating corporate sustainability more into the business plan. In that way, you can say that the company becomes a stakeholder amongst many other stakeholders, where the purpose then is what you want to focus on and clarify.
Quyen, go ahead.
Sure. I think so. It's really interesting. I think when you ask the question of convergence, it may suggest there's one solution, but I think we all here already know that it takes multiple efforts to reinforce it. Just like healthcare, to be healthy, there's multiple things that must be done: preventive, access, treatment, all that, education. Learning a language, there's multiple reinforced mechanisms for learning. Likewise here, there's no one convergence, but hopefully a convergence of convergences. So on the investment side, for Jette, when she mentioned, incorporating purpose into corporate sustainability practice, I mean, that's absolutely going to make a difference. On the investment side, where I can speak to in detail, I do see convergence in setting standards for measurement. Specifically, there's an effort, it's a wonderful effort that began with the Impact Weighted Accounts Initiative. It's grown, now it's a part of a larger foundation, and it's a global effort. And what it's doing, and this is what our students in class learn, it's still in the early stages, but it's very doable. It's meant to be a complement to traditional accounting standards, so generally accepted accounting principles, GAAP, not a replacement. But what it does is you can analyze a company's profits. So let's say it's Pfizer, Walmart, Coca-Cola, it doesn't matter. You can analyze a company's profits. And then using this methodology, you can understand and you can quantify directionally, right? It's never perfect, quantifying, but you can quantify for every dollar of profit that this company generates, what is the environmental damage in terms of dollars that it creates, or environmental progress. So we're able to do that. And in fact, it's been done for over 2,000 companies that are publicly traded, and it's on their website. It's really, really very encouraging, because when it does this, it allows where the capital allocators are, the investors, the finance, they can see with transparency, the impact that they may not even realize. And then if we apply it beyond just environment, to other things, employment impact, product impact, a product that is full of sugar that causes, obesity in children, generally, that can be accounted for in the profitability statement. How much health harm does it cause based on evidence and research? So the convergence of positive and negative environmental and social impact is being conversion to the financial accounting statements upfront. So it's not something like an ESG rating where we look backwards, but it's right there as we're making the decision of whether or not to invest, allocate more capital, et cetera. And one thing that I can mention, just not from it is from the investment lens, but it can be applied to all of us, not just the investors. But when we look at ESG ratings, it's interesting because we're setting such a high bar for the convergence of ESG ratings when we don't do the same for stock ratings. So if you were to pick any stock, when it releases earnings, you'll have a whole bunch of different views from sell side. Morgan Stanley, Goldman Sachs, all the sell side researchers will have very different views: strong buy, strong sell, short the stock, and yet we don't expect them to converge. And understanding that, then we apply an opportunity to pick the right stocks for the, from our role. So I would encourage the industry to do the same. Realize that they're probably never going to converge, and they're built for different reasons. Sustainalytics and MSCI, they're competitors, by the way. So we shouldn't expect that, but we also shouldn't be disheartened and then throw everything out, but just see, like sell side research, we don't expect them to converge. If we understand it on the sustainable, we can then take action and decide, well, then what matters to us?
Thank you, Quyen. And I just want to, as a footnote, add to that there are efforts by other agencies, organizations that are setting standards, like the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, the Carbon Disclosure Project, to actually now get together and to talk about an industry-wide set of standards or approaches to actually measuring their social impact, which is something that actually a number of our students are involved in. Bhaskar, did you want to add anything on this convergence issue?
Yeah, I think, convergence is a term that we all love here at Fletcher, because Fletcher is about convergence. It's about, many different disciplines, many different perspectives, many different experiences, cultural, socio-economic backgrounds that are coming together in a place like this. And, you exchange ideas, you learn. I find that one of the best places to learn about convergence, not just learn, but practice convergence, is when you're right in the middle of a hurricane, because that's when all the stuff starts converging in a real way. And so how do we apply that? So I think about crises as enormously important moments in our lives when things converge, because they have to. You have no other option. So I'll give you a couple of examples that we found particularly profound over the last few years. We know that we've got plenty of crises to choose from. I'll give you a couple. One is the war in Ukraine. So the war in Ukraine was an enormously unfortunate tragedy that is still unfolding. But at the same time, it became a living lab for many of the issues that we have been studying here at Fletcher, which is, imagining a digital economy for all. How do we think about digital technology as a way to wage that war? At the start of the war, the World Bank predicted that the Ukrainian economy was going to tank by 45% by the end of 2022. So we made the assumption that pretty much the physical infrastructure in Ukraine was going to collapse. The ports on the Black Sea and many other critical parts of the physical infrastructure was not going to be functional, which meant that Ukraine's biggest exports were going to be blocked and would not be able to leave the shores of the country. However, the third largest export for Ukraine is technology. And as long as the internet is functioning, technology could continue to function as product coming out of Ukraine. Now, as it turns out, because of the 2014 invasion of Crimea, Ukrainian tech companies had learned their lesson. They realized that they needed to build not just one backup plan for internet access, but backup plan number 2, 3, and 4. And most of the tech companies actually have multiple backup plans. As a result, even without Elon Musk's help, they can actually get access to the internet pretty much through the war. So what that meant was, if we could get the word out to the rest of the world, that the Ukrainian tech industry can actually do the work that you want them to do. They have fantastic engineers, programmers, and coders who are sitting not necessarily in their homes, not necessarily in their offices, because there was another crisis called COVID-19, which sent everybody remote. So you could be in Poland, you could be in Germany, you could be in Ukraine, and you could be working. Your internet was functioning, and you could send work to Ukraine, and the tech industry could deliver. By the end of the year, the tech exports of Ukraine, the tech sector of Ukraine, grew by about 30%. By 30% in the middle of a war. It's probably never happened in the history of wars. So it's an interesting place where things converge. I also think the added convergence on the technological platform in Ukraine, there's an app called Dia in Ukraine, which is essentially an app that Ukrainians could use prior to the war to get things like, access to driver's licenses, permits for building, remodeling, and things like that. Now, that same app became powerful post-war for Ukrainians to learn about, where emergency help could be obtained. They could learn about jobs that were available, that could be done remotely. They could post videos of the advances of Russian tanks in their neighborhoods, so that the ministry in Ukraine could track the journey of the Russian military. So that's kind of one gigantic crisis, which, many things converge. The other gigantic crisis, of course, is COVID. And one of the issues that we looked at during COVID is how useful was AI in tracking and capturing and catching people who demonstrated symptoms, and could we actually tell whether they had COVID or not, just by their cough or by their presentation. And it turned out that AI massively failed on that front. And also simultaneously, while we were all despairing that AI could ever be a useful tool, at the same time, AI actually helped advance the development of a vaccine, and basically have brought us to this point where we can all get together like this, and most of us are healthy and safe, and feel healthy and safe getting together in moments like this. So crises, great way to find opportunities for convergence. Not that we should be looking for crises, but crises will look for us, and good time for us to practice it.
So we're seeing convergence, but obviously a lot of work to do. I want to open up the floor to questions. I'm going to pose one question to the panel for us to come back to at the end. So if you've got a question here, please come to the microphone and we'll turn to you. But I'm going to announce my question to you for the end, so that it's a warm call in a sense, which is, we're talking about business and sustainability. Why not just leave this to the business schools? Why have this conversation at Fletcher? So hold that thought, we'll close with that. First question, please introduce yourself, tell us which class at Fletcher you were, and pose your question.
Hello, my name is Albert Bouchade Faré. I am a MALT 2013. And I've worked with endowed foundations, and years ago, there was lots of conversations around impact investing. And I was in some meetings where they were comparing notes about their experiences on doing that. And one of the upshots was that you had to really squint really hard to make the argument that impact investing at that moment was yielding just better or even same financial results. And so I wonder, for Professor Tran, what are the arguments that are closer or actually to winning on the con side? Because it's easy for us to, say that, impact investing is good, morally, ESGs are good. I'm curious to learn more about the contrarian view. When is it not good? When are students making the best arguments against it? And also along those lines, I guess there's a broad political policy question about where is the line between when is there a greater social good for companies pursuing ESGs in-house, and when it is inefficient, and it would be and the company should not pursue all of like the sustainability in-house, but allow them to have some negative externalities that the society through other means can more efficiently deal with than forcing each company to become experts on many more fields than what they would have to be years ago in a simpler world. And and finally, there was this argument in The Economist a few years ago that said that incumbent large companies now face less threats from smaller startups because of the increasing complexity of regulations, that larger companies can afford an army of lawyers to comply with everything, but the smaller companies just face a much tougher challenge in actually existing and being able to deal with all the increased requirements of what they have to do in-house. So I'll leave you that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Albert. Quyen, since he called on you, but I also want Ken to weigh in on this after you.
Yes, and you should come back to class and be a speaker. And actually, that's why we should have this discipline here, because that is complex, not just with business questions. So by your first question, by definition, impact investing is to generate positive outcomes. For it to be negative, I would say if it's compromising unexpectedly, accidentally, something that's not sustainable, whether it's doing significant harm, then it cannot unwind, or it's not sustainable in that it's concessionary to the point where it's going to end. Concessionary meaning you have to give up returns. In practice, impact investing by definition allows us to give up returns. You don't have to necessarily aim for market performance or outperformance. Such strategies tend to have subsidies. But the definition of impact investing is to generate positive returns. I don't know if that was what your positive impact, environmental, social, alongside some financial returns. So there can be, but there need not be a trade-off. So it depends on what you're investing in. So if you were just to look at supply and demand for solutions in need, we know that there's far more problems in the world than there are solutions, unfortunately. I mean, the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals sets all that out with a lot of statistics on these problems that actually been exacerbated because of COVID and the war. Knowing that there's more demand for solutions than there are supply, if you're an enterprise that has a product or a service, healthcare, access to the internet, access to education, if you have a solution to that problem for which there's not enough supply, that supply-demand dynamic, that imbalance provides a structural growth tailwind for demand for your product. And so that growth should help propel the financial returns. So in other words, the product that you have that's creating impact is also the reason for that competitive advantage from a business perspective. You have a competitive moat. Let's say you just had the latest breakthrough in treating a type of cancer with the least side effects. That is impact on a health perspective. And it's also, let's say it's affordable. Then of course the demand for that will be really strong. So the strategies in impact investing where there is strong demand for a solution where there's not enough supply, you have that financial business growth, competitive moat that protects you. That is the reason for your outperformance. So it's interdisciplinary, but there are a lot of solutions that have just without the impact part of it from a supply demand perspective, they have that competitive moat, they have the competitive edge. They're the best player in the industry, whether it's a breakthrough technology, patent, or healthcare solution. And they're going to win financially, whether or not you're evaluating it for impact. Does that make sense?
Let's hear what the others have to say as well. I know the others want to weigh in. Jette, and then we'll come back.
Yes, because I actually disagree with you, Quyen. I think that it's just when companies make decisions about sustainability, they always make decisions about trade-offs. They make decisions about financial profitability, and they make decisions about societal gains. We like to tell a story, and that comes from Michael Porter, about win-win. You know, you engage in ESG, you engage in sustainability, and you're going to have your cake and eat it too. And that's certainly the case in some examples, but the really interesting and the hard decisions are about making those trade-offs. And I think to your question, about the role of government and how do you draw the line, I think it's really important for companies to be very clear about the fact that they do not have democratic legitimacy. They're not elected, so that they can only go so far in terms of engaging in social policy, environmental policy, and so on. They can push, like you were talking about before in your example, Ken, but it's fair enough for companies to say we can only do certain things because that's within our purpose, that's within our prerogative, and then we can work with politicians to make things better. But ultimately, it'll always be a discussion about trade-offs.
Ken.
Nomenclature matters a ton here. We don't have enough time, I don't think, to define all the terms that we're throwing out, but ESG investing overall is comprised of lots of different strategies. One of them is impact. And I'm enormously bullish about impact investing as a way to deliver social and environmental benefit. And in some cases, like Quyen said, financial returns. In other cases, it is concessionary. The category, though, overall, according to GIN, which is a global impact investing network, just topped $1 trillion for the first time, which is good news because it's growing. But that represents less than 1% of overall professionally invested capital. And the biggest category, by the way, in impact investing of the different asset classes today is private equity, where they are seeking to deliver financial returns alongside impact. So I love impact investing. I think it's necessary. It's often concessionary, but it's small. And so it won't be the solution. It can be part of the solution, I'd say.
Before I want to address the cons piece just very briefly, and then we'll turn to your question. You've been waiting very patiently. In my mind, the best argument that I've seen is what you provided actually in your second question, which was efficiency, right? That it makes sense for companies to focus on delivering what they're delivering, and that it may be inefficient for them to be paying attention to environment or health or other kinds of social benefits. And there too, there's a trade-off, right? There's an implicit one that we've allowed firms to make forever, which is that you can pollute, you can impose health costs, you can impose costs on human equity and not have any consequences for it. And so the role of regulation in a sense becomes, is there an alternative? You can stick to your old business model, but then maybe you pay for carbon that you're emitting. Maybe that's the most efficient solution for you, to pay a carbon tax, for instance, or to engage in carbon trading, where you would actually pay dollars for it, rather than trying to mitigate it on the front end. And so in a sense, it's about counting all of these aspects of the economy in a way that we haven't done before. And I think the impact weighted accounts are one way of actually approaching that. So I think there is room for an efficiency argument. And in fact, many economists would push for it, because you might not want everybody to do carbon capture if you're a polluting industry, but you want to incorporate that into your calculus by actually having to pay for it. So in my mind, it's a powerful argument, and we need to be able to figure out how to incorporate it. Your question, please. Introduce yourself and your connection with Fletcher, and your question.
Thank you. So my name is Saima Kadir, Fletcher 98. I work in the voluntary carbon market, and I'm actually grappling with this very issue daily and putting together assessment frameworks for different asset classes of carbon credits and what is a high quality credit, what is acceptable. We see it very much as an ESG asset and the problems we're having. So my question really for Professor Tran and the whole panel is the ground realities, and how do you think we can get to this convergence in practice and in time, given the climate emergency And where I'm coming from, what we're learning is that it's a very interdisciplinary topic, and especially these so-called new ratings agencies lack the capacity. You need a certain level of technical depth, but also integrated thinking, which simply doesn't exist. And everybody's screaming for impact, but impact costs money. MRV is very expensive. And also on the impact side, the practicality is if you really want benefits to go to communities, you are giving up a certain percentage of the profit and how much is acceptable. And without a regulated price of carbon right now, how do you get there? You really can't. Everybody wants cheap carbon credits for future regulation right now, but the prices aren't there to get you the quality that's needed for ESG. So I just wanted to get all of your thoughts on, in practice, the hardcore, and particularly with the climate emergency, how do you think we can get to that convergence and time? What is needed? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Saima. Let's take this question as well, and then we'll give the panel a chance to respond and also to give your closing remark, because I'm getting the hook. We've got about 5 minutes. Let's get your question and we'll get your question as well. Please introduce yourself.
I'm Emily. I'm GBA and I graduate tomorrow.
Congratulations.
Thanks. Hi, Dean Chakravorti and Professor Pucker. I took sustainability a couple terms ago with you. And in our class, we talked about systems thinking and being an actor in a system, in a large progressive organization. I was in the sports apparel industry before, now in device industry. As an actor in a system, how can we get involved if we're really interested in this, if our role is not directly within ESG, but we do want to make some advances forward?
Thank you, Emily. And last question, please.
Hi, I'm Rami Christ of Fletcher 98. I think my question is sort of related. So we've talked a lot about the corporate side, but I'm actually interested in your thoughts, starting with Professor Pucker, but really with all of you, about how we can involve consumers or sort of the general public, because I feel like in this era, we're in a really highly consumerist era. You know, I have 13-year-old kids, they're on TikTok, they want to buy stuff they see. But at the same time, the younger generations are also very focused, and rightly so, on climate, and there's sort of this cognitive dissonance. And yet, at the end of the day, everyone's used to having what they want when they want it. So how do companies such as H&M, which I think is, I've actually been following, I find it interesting, they're doing marketing about turning in your old clothes and so forth. How do we engage sort of the general people as Fletcher graduates and Fletcher professors to start thinking about this and changing their behavior, which, as we all know, is very difficult. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So we've got 3 questions. Take any one of them that you like, but you have to end on the line of, why do this at Fletcher and not at a business school? I'm not going to let go of that.
So I'm happy to take the last question first. There's this incredible paradox. If you look at Gen Z and look at polling information, they're the most concerned about sustainability of any generation, and yet they're the biggest buyers of fast fashion online. If you look at Shein's business, for example, if you're probably over 20, you might not know the brand. If you're under it, you probably obsess about the brand. And they sell, you know, $9 halter tops and $15 pairs of jeans and $10 dresses. And I don't think there's a lack of intention when it comes to those surveys. I think Gen Z does care. And I think they care because they see with more acuity and intimacy the challenges that we've left them. But it's really hard to act on those things because the information's wildly incomplete. And so if you were to ask an average consumer, what's better, an organic cotton t-shirt or a nylon t-shirt? The answer is it depends. And if the answer is it depends, it's really hard to ask a consumer to go do the research to figure out, do I care about water? Do I care about emissions? What about how long will this last? How will it be disposed of? And so I think it's very difficult to rely on consumers to drive the change. I think it's more possible to rely on citizens, meaning I think that if enough people are concerned, they can force change in terms of governance. And that's why I think it's important to study these things at Fletcher, because left to their own devices in the system that we operate in, I don't think consumers, companies, or investors alone will individually drive the change. I think you need policy. I think you need NGOs. I think you need media in order to drive citizens to force the change.
Quyen, please.
Definitely agree with Ken. There's actually a lot that we can do. And I will tie it back to Fletcher. So we're all affiliated with some organization, whether it's our work, our volunteer work, community organizations. And there's always these working groups at the GIN, at the the Impact Weighted Accounts Initiative, where they develop a new framework, a new standard, new methodology to self-serve. So it's open architecture. You just need to let them know, I would like to apply your environmental impact analysis to my organization. We generate certain amount of revenues. We have certain activities. If I can capture the environmental impact, then I can share with my organization something they may not even realize about their activities. It actually is helping the environment or hurting the environment. So there are tools and templates available, thankfully, on the internet, on their websites. There are also working groups at the GIN, at the Impact Frontiers organization, depending on where your interest is, environmental or social. These organizations tend to be nonprofit. They welcome corporations, nonprofits, organizations, enterprises to participate. And that way you can, one, measure your own footprint and then decide what you want to do about it. So there's a lot that can be done. You just need to ask us, ask alums, where you're most interested and where can you volunteer. Usually it doesn't take too long. Now, and they would love it. They usually put their case studies online too. So-and-so, this organization ran the analysis of their own enterprise and this is what they look like, if you're willing to share that. There are also, if you're, it doesn't matter if you're a current student, recent graduate, or, just an industry practitioner, if you want to learn about these issues, you can, so that you become more fluent in them. There are a lot of certifications from SASB, financial, I forget the acronym, but it's like a sustainability certification, sustainable analyst certification. There's the CFA Institute that has an ESG certification. We're going to launch the impact investing certification pilot stage this December, and it'll roll out come next year. So there are things that you can study and not sit for the exam or sit for the exam, but you will increase your fluency and your empowerment to say, whether it's at your work or the affiliated organization that you're in, you can say the things that you care about and ask if there are things that can be done to move forward with the change that you seek. So there's a lot of self-empowerment tools. And if you're not sure where to go, you can email me or, reach out to whomever that you have in the community, because I know that everybody really wants to move towards the same direction, but how is hard. So at Fletcher, that's what we do. We teach our students how. Professor Shayna is not here today, but he encourages all of his students to compete in the competitions where they did win, to volunteer and ask MSCI for data so they can do their capstone project. They're asking how, because they want to do so much, but it's like access, where to start. The how is hard. But at Fletcher, we have those resources.
And I want to just add two of the organizations that Quyen mentioned, the Impact Weighted Accounts and the Global Impact Investing Network. We have Fletcher alumni in both of those. So we've infiltrated. Jette.
Yeah, thank you. So we had a question about the voluntary carbon market, and I think with respect to the rating agencies, I can't see this person who asked it. Thanks. I think with respect to the agencies, I think they have rating agencies, they're very well aware that they need to step up the kind of expertise that they have. Typically, they hire undergraduates and then they sit and do ratings for environment, social, and governance. And at least from my correspondence and sort of communications with some of these rating agencies, they are thinking about changing that so that you have experts in the E, so that in terms of rating on the carbon market, you have somebody who actually knows about it. Now, will we get there soon? I don't know, but I think there's at least awareness that is necessary. With respect to consumers, I completely agree with you, Ken. I think consumers are important, but consumers are also ultimately, many at least, very price aware, and the information out there about what makes for a sustainable product, it's just very confusing to figure out. So I would focus on government and engaging in governance and government at whatever level you can. And sort of coming back to the question you were asking us, Alnoor, what is it that Fletcher can offer? I think it's an understanding of the world is complex and governance issues are very complex, but you get here, I think, a very broad range of sort of understanding of that complexity, and especially having students from around the world who can bring different perspectives from different sectors, from different countries, from different industries, whether it's government or civil society organizations or business, is immensely valuable. So I think a lot of our students are really well placed to be working in this space. And as Alnoor already mentioned, a lot of our students have also infiltrated organizations that focus on this, or they're working as Molly here directly in companies focusing on sustainability. So I think as a Fletcher student, this is a golden era with respect to sustainable business. There'll be lots of opportunities for you to be working on this with a Fletcher background.
Last but not least.
Bhaskar.
So it's interesting that we had three really interesting questions, which could have occupied us for the rest of the day, and we still wouldn't get to an answer, but at least we'll have a really fantastic conversation. But I think we are in negative time territory, so I'm going to punt on those questions, but at least answer the question that Alnoor had. Why talk about business at Fletcher and just leave it to the business schools? I think business is far too important to leave it to the business schools. Just to give you one quick example, and building off of Jette's two things that she noted. One is she mentioned the Rana Plaza disaster in Bangladesh, and the other is she mentioned Michael Porter and the win-win shared value concept, which is actually quite popular in conversations around business schools. These two things are connected in the following sense. I won't hold Michael responsible for Rana Plaza, but I do believe his theories, which actually got him to a level of international standing and essentially influence across every business school and every business program in the world, was not really shared value. But it's the so-called 5 forces analysis with which we begin every business conversation in business schools and right here at Fletcher. And it is a legitimate place to start the role of choice and strategy in how to allocate resources. Starts with an understanding of who wields market power. 5 forces is about market power. And market power suggests that if you are an apparel manufacturer, if you're an apparel branding company, what you should do is you should apply your market power to squeeze your suppliers as much as possible against the wall, right? And what does that do? That leads to rickety buildings in which poor Bangladeshi women are manufacturing the t-shirts that we wear and we buy at rock bottom prices, and those buildings fall down. And then those women are actually asked to complete their t-shirt quota by working at home if they survive the building collapse. So what I fear business schools have done is they start with 5 forces at the beginning of the business program. They end with shared value, again, a complete arc, Michael Porter, at the end of the program. And in between, there is very little connectivity or even an understanding that there's actually a tension between these two concepts. At Fletcher, we acknowledge the tension, and we acknowledge the contradictions, and we acknowledge that both of these elements have to coexist. And a true leader, not a business leader, a true problem solver, can hold these two ideas together in their minds and figure out how to not let the next Rana Plaza happen. And I believe the next Rana Plaza, if it doesn't happen, those ideas are going to come out of Fletcher. And business schools so far have not lived up to the promises of kind of preventing things like that from happening. So this is kind of a bit of a broad side on business schools, but I do believe that Fletcher is the place where we can indeed try to prevent these kinds of catastrophes.
Thank you, Bhaskar. I want to add there that Bhaskar, Jette, and I have each taught at major business schools for a number of years. And the ability to hold this kind of conversation that goes between the firm, the market, civil society, citizens, policy, regulation, systems. The ability to hold that conversation does not occur in business schools. It occurs every day here at Fletcher, which is why we need to have this conversation on an ongoing basis here. I want to close by saying that one of our degrees, the Master of International Business, we've just gone through a major process of reforming it. The new version launches in the fall. And sustainability, business sustainability, is at the heart of every core course in the revised curriculum. We've also added a STEM track to increase the quantitative strength of various aspects of it. And we're seeing an uptick actually in applications. So there's a real appetite for studying that kind of work here at Fletcher, coming on the tails of the remarkable students that have taken that degree before and have made a name for it out there. So we thank you for that. The last thing I want to say is that there's another whole side to this at Fletcher that we haven't even touched upon, which is the Climate Policy Lab, the Center for International Environment and Resource Policy, which does a massive amount of work for countries on climate policy work, Dean Gallagher and others. And so all of that comes together within the school. But the 4 faculty you have here are going to be core to teaching in the revised Master of International Business. So I'm delighted to have you as colleagues and delighted to have all of you as alumni. Lunch awaits us. Thank you for being here.